Snow fell in thick curtains across the frozen Belgian Ardennes Forest in December 1944 as Allied nurse Captain Sarah Mitchell pressed her back against the rough bark of an oak tree, her breath coming in sharp white clouds. The distant rumble of German tanks had been growing louder for the past hour, and now she could hear voices shouting in German less than 100 yards away. Her hands shook as she checked on the 3 wounded soldiers lying in the makeshift shelter behind her, their blood dark against the pristine snow. She had been separated from the 107th Evacuation Hospital unit 12 hours earlier when Wehrmacht forces smashed through American lines in what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. And now 57 nurses and support staff were scattered across 20 square miles of enemy-controlled forest. By December 20th, just 4 days into the German offensive, the situation had become a nightmare that military planners never anticipated. The surprise attack had captured over 4,000 Allied personnel in the first 72 hours, and among them were dozens of women serving as nurses, communications operators, and medical support staff. German commanders immediately faced a problem that made their tactical officers nervous and uncertain. How could they tell the difference between legitimate Allied military nurses who deserved protection under the Geneva Convention and the Belgian and French resistance fighters who had been causing havoc behind German lines for months? The women caught with weapons often carried forged medical documents and wore stolen Red Cross insignia. 23 confirmed cases of armed women posing as medical personnel had been documented in German intelligence reports over the previous 6 weeks. The penalty for being caught as a partisan was immediate execution. The protection for being a legitimate prisoner of war was food, shelter, and eventual repatriation. The numbers told a stark story that kept German intelligence officers awake at night. In November alone, resistance attacks in Belgium and northern France had killed 147 German soldiers, destroyed 32 supply trucks, and cut communication lines in 18 separate incidents. The attacks were becoming more sophisticated and more deadly. Wehrmacht officers had standing orders to treat captured partisans as unlawful combatants, subject to military justice, which usually meant a firing squad within 24 hours of capture. But the Geneva Convention, which Germany had signed and publicly claimed to honor, strictly protected medical personnel. Shooting a legitimate nurse would be a war crime that could bring severe consequences when the war ended. And by December 1944, even the most optimistic German officers knew the war would eventually end, and tribunals would follow. Traditional interrogation methods were failing spectacularly. A woman could memorize details about hospital procedures from a single conversation with a real nurse. Accents could be disguised or explained away as regional variations. Documents could be forged with skill that fooled even experienced document examiners. The Gestapo had interrogated 17 suspected partisan women in early December using standard techniques, including sleep deprivation, isolation, and psychological pressure. But 12 of them had maintained their cover stories so effectively that German commanders finally released them as prisoners of war, knowing full well that at least half were probably resistance fighters who would rejoin their units the moment they escaped or were liberated. The problem landed on the desk of Dr. Klaus Brenner, a middle-aged medical officer from Hamburg who had spent 20 years as a civilian doctor before being conscripted into Wehrmacht service. Brenner hated the war and hated the SS even more, but he understood military necessity and the impossible position his commanders faced. He worked alongside Hauptmann Wilhelm Fest, an intelligence officer who had interrogated dozens of suspected spies and partisans over the past 2 years. Together, they reviewed the medical records of captured Allied personnel and noticed something that civilian resistance fighters could never fake. Every single legitimate Allied military nurse in their files showed the same pattern of vaccination scars from their required military medical processing. The records were precise and consistent. United States Army nurses received typhoid vaccinations that left distinctive circular scars approximately 2 centimeters in diameter on the upper left arm, administered between 1942 and 1944 as part of mandatory deployment preparation. Smallpox vaccinations created a characteristic pattern of 3 to 5 millimeters on the upper arm, easily visible and impossible to mistake for anything else. Tetanus boosters left small marks on the deltoid muscle or occasionally on the hip. British and Canadian military nurses showed similar patterns, slightly different in placement but equally distinctive. The vaccinations were required, documented, and administered by military medical personnel who followed standardized procedures. Resistance fighters, no matter how dedicated or well-trained, had only received childhood vaccinations given years or decades earlier in different locations with different techniques. Brenner presented his findings to the camp commandant on December 19th with a formal report that included photographs, statistical analysis, and detailed medical descriptions. The commandant, a career officer who desperately wanted clear guidelines that would protect him from both partisan attacks and war crimes accusations, approved the protocol immediately. The order went out to detention facilities across the region that same evening. All captured women claiming medical or support personnel status would undergo physical examination to verify their vaccination scars. Those with proper military vaccination marks would be processed as prisoners of war and afforded full Geneva Convention protections. Those without the marks would face immediate investigation as suspected unlawful combatants. The order was simple and terrifying. German medical officers would inspect captured women and deliver 4 words that made prisoners tremble. "We need to see your marks." The first inspections were scheduled for December 22nd at Stalag 9B, where 89 captured women waited in cold barracks. Now understanding that these 4 words would determine whether they lived as protected prisoners or died as convicted spies. Word spread quickly through the prisoner population about the new German procedure, and the phrase became a whispered warning that made women's faces go pale with fear. The inspection protocol that Dr. Brenner designed was coldly methodical and disturbingly precise. Female prisoners would be separated into groups of 10 and brought into a designated examination room where German female medical personnel would conduct the physical inspections under armed guard supervision. The examiners had been given detailed instructions with accompanying photographs showing exactly what to look for. They needed to identify 3 specific marks that would prove military medical processing. First, the upper left arm typhoid vaccination scar measuring approximately 2 centimeters in diameter, a circular mark with slightly raised edges that had been administered between 1942 and 1944. Second, the smallpox vaccination mark on the upper arm showing the distinctive pattern of 3 to 5 millimeters with a characteristic pockmarked appearance that military doctors created using a bifurcated needle technique. Third, the tetanus injection sites that typically appeared on the deltoid muscle as small pinpoint scars, sometimes faded but usually still visible under proper lighting. The examination room at Stalag 9B had been a storage facility before the war, a concrete box with high windows that let in weak December sunlight. German medical staff set up 3 examination stations with portable lamps that cast harsh white light across the space. A wooden table held leather-bound journals where findings would be recorded, along with reference photographs mounted on cardboard showing examples of authentic military vaccination scars. The room smelled of disinfectant and cold concrete, and the temperature hovered just above freezing despite a small wood stove burning in the corner. Guards stood at each door with rifles held across their chests, their breath visible in the frigid air. On the morning of December 22, 1944, the first group of 10 women entered the examination room. Captain Sarah Mitchell was among them, and she watched as the other women removed their coats with trembling hands. A German medical officer named Greta Hoffmann, a stern woman in her 40s wearing a grey uniform, explained the procedure in heavily accented English. Each woman would approach the examination table, remove her outer garments to expose both arms, and stand under the lamp while the inspector verified the presence and authenticity of required vaccination marks. The inspection would take approximately 3 minutes per person. Results would be recorded immediately. Women who passed the inspection would receive red identification cards marking them as verified prisoners of war. Women who failed would receive yellow cards and face additional questioning. Sarah stepped forward when her turn came, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone in the room could hear it. She had protested this violation of privacy to the German commandant the previous day, arguing that it degraded the dignity of medical personnel and violated the spirit, if not the letter of the Geneva Convention. The commandant had listened politely and done absolutely nothing to change the orders. Now she stood under the bright lamp, while Hoffmann examined her left arm with clinical detachment, and the inspector's fingers were cold as she touched the vaccination scar, measuring it with a small ruler and comparing the appearance to the reference photograph. Hoffman moved to Sarah's right arm, checking for the smallpox mark, then asked her to turn slightly so the shoulder could be examined for tetanus injection sites. The entire process took 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Hoffman made 3 notations in the leather journal, nodded once, and handed Sarah a red identification card. Relief flooded through Sarah's body so intensely she felt dizzy. She had passed. She was verified. She would live as a prisoner of war instead of dying as a suspected spy. As she put her coat back on with shaking hands, she watched the next woman step forward, a young supply clerk named Patricia Chen, who had been captured near Bastogne. Patricia's face was pale with terror as she removed her jacket and rolled up her sleeves. The inspection proceeded with mechanical efficiency through the morning. Of the first 30 women examined, 22 received red cards and 8 received yellow cards. The women with red cards were led to a separate barracks where they would be processed as official prisoners of war, given proper documentation, and eventually transferred to permanent detention facilities where Geneva Convention rules would protect them. The women with yellow cards were taken to an interrogation building where Hauptmann Fest and his team would conduct intensive questioning to determine their true identities and affiliations. By the end of the first day at Stalag 9B, 89 women had undergone the vaccination inspection protocol. 67 showed the complete pattern of military vaccination marks and received immediate prisoner of war status. 22 women lacked the distinctive scars that would prove their military service. Among those 22, interrogations over the following 3 days revealed that 18 were indeed Belgian resistance fighters who had obtained stolen medical insignia and forged documents. 4 were legitimate Allied support personnel who had somehow avoided the standard vaccination requirements due to medical allergies or administrative errors. These 4 presented such detailed knowledge of military procedures and had such extensive documentation that even Fest reluctantly classified them as prisoners of war despite the missing vaccination marks. The results convinced German commanders that the method worked. Orders went out on December 28 to implement the vaccination inspection protocol at all detention facilities holding female prisoners claiming military medical or support status. The technical specifications were transmitted by coded radio message to 47 separate camps across German-controlled territory. Each facility received detailed instructions, including the precise measurements to look for, the characteristic appearance of authentic military vaccination scars, and the documentation procedures to follow. Resistance networks in Belgium and France learned about the new German inspection method within 72 hours through underground communication channels, but there was nothing they could do to counter it effectively. Some resistance leaders attempted to create fake vaccination scars using heated metal implements to burn circular marks into women's arms, hoping the scars would fool German medical inspectors. The attempts failed completely. Hoffman and other experienced medical examiners could instantly distinguish between a fresh burn that had healed for only weeks and an authentic vaccination scar that had developed over months or years. Real vaccination marks showed specific tissue patterns, slight discoloration, and characteristic texture that couldn't be replicated with crude burning techniques. Women caught with obviously fake scars faced even harsher interrogation because the forgery attempt proved they were trying to deceive their captors. Captain Mitchell watched as the protocol spread through the prisoner population like a cold wind. Women who had served their countries with courage and dedication now lived or died based on small marks on their arms that they had barely noticed when military doctors administered the shots years earlier. The scars that had seemed like minor inconveniences during training now represented the only proof of identity that German commanders would accept without question. By January 1945, just 1 month after implementation, German forces had already processed over 300 captured women using the vaccination inspection protocol, and the statistics painted a stark picture of the method's effectiveness. 73% of examined women passed the inspection and received prisoner of war status with full Geneva Convention protections. 19% failed the inspection and faced charges as unlawful combatants, and with most eventually admitting to resistance activities under interrogation. 8% showed ambiguous markings that required additional investigation, including women with partial vaccination records, unusual scar placement, or medical conditions that had prevented standard immunization procedures. The numbers proved what Dr. Brenner had suspected from the beginning. The vaccination marks provided a biological identifier that no amount of training, forged documents, or memorized stories could fake. The practice spread like wildfire across German-controlled territories, as word of its success reached Wehrmacht headquarters. Allied intelligence officers monitoring prisoner communications documented the vaccination inspection protocol in 47 separate detention facilities by the time the war ended in May. Each facility followed the same basic procedure with minor variations. Some used female Wehrmacht medical personnel as inspectors, while others employed civilian German nurses who had been pressed into military service. Some facilities conducted examinations in heated rooms, while others forced women to stand in freezing warehouses. But the core method remained identical: roll up your sleeves, stand under the light, and let German medical officers determine your fate based on scars you probably never thought about before your capture. The physical examinations became a dreaded ritual that women described in remarkably similar terms decades later, when historians finally convinced them to share their experiences. They remembered waiting in lines that stretched down cold corridors, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air as they shuffled forward one position at a time. They remembered the sound of boots on concrete floors echoing off bare walls, the rhythmic clicking that seemed to count down to judgment. They remembered the smell of disinfectant mixed with wood smoke from inadequate heating stoves, a combination that made some women feel sick with anxiety. They remembered the harsh glare of electric lights or sometimes kerosene lamps that cast yellow illumination across examination tables. They remembered the clinical detachment of German medical officers who touched their arms with cold fingers, measuring scars with small rulers, comparing patterns against reference photographs, making notations in leather journals with scratching pens that sounded unbearably loud in quiet rooms. British and American commands protested the practice through neutral diplomatic channels, arguing that forced physical examinations violated the dignity and privacy of captured military personnel. The International Committee of the Red Cross received formal complaints from both governments in early January requesting intervention to stop what they termed degrading treatment of female prisoners. German officials responded with carefully worded legal justifications that cited Article 85 of the Geneva Convention, which explicitly allowed for reasonable verification of prisoner status to ensure proper treatment under international law. The German argument was technically sound, even if morally questionable. They were not torturing prisoners or denying them basic necessities. They were simply verifying that women claiming military medical status actually had proof of military medical processing. The examinations involved no more physical contact than a routine medical checkup and took only a few minutes per person. The legal maneuvering meant nothing to the women undergoing the inspections. For them, the experience was humiliating, regardless of how German lawyers justified it. Standing under bright lights, while enemy medical officers examined their bodies for marks that would determine whether they lived or died, felt like a violation that transcended technical definitions of prisoner rights. Some women reported feeling like livestock being inspected for sale. Others described a sense of powerlessness that was worse than the fear of combat because at least in battle they had some control over their actions. Here they could only stand still and hope that vaccinations received years ago had left scars visible enough to satisfy German inspectors. One unintended consequence emerged that German commanders had not anticipated. The vaccination inspection protocol became so well known among Allied forces that it actually improved compliance with military medical requirements. By March 1945, British and American medical commands had implemented new procedures requiring photographic documentation of all vaccinations administered to military personnel. Each soldier or nurse received a medical card with attached photographs showing their vaccination scars, along with precise measurements, dates of administration, and the name of the medical officer who performed the procedure. The documentation created a backup identification system that would remain standard military practice for decades, evolving through the Cold War and into modern biometric identification systems. Resistance networks attempted various countermeasures once they understood how the German inspection protocol worked. Underground medical personnel tried creating fake vaccination scars using heated implements to burn circular marks into women's arms. The technique involved heating a metal rod or coin to high temperature and pressing it against the upper arm for several seconds, creating a burn that would theoretically heal into a scar resembling a vaccination mark. The attempts failed with painful consistency. Experienced German medical examiners like Greta Hoffmann could spot fake scars within seconds of examination. Real vaccination scars developed over months with specific tissue patterns, slight variations in pigmentation, and characteristic texture from the body's immune response to the vaccine. Fake burn scars showed none of these features. The tissue damage was too uniform, the coloration too consistent, and the texture completely wrong. Women caught with obviously counterfeit scars faced even more aggressive interrogation because the forgery attempt proved they were deliberately trying to deceive their captors about their true identities. The comparison between different verification methods highlighted why the German vaccination protocol proved so effective. Traditional interrogation techniques relied on breaking down a prisoner's story through psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, and inconsistency analysis. A well-trained resistance fighter could maintain a cover identity for days or even weeks under such pressure. Document examination required expertise and time, and skilled forgers could create papers that fooled most inspectors. Accent analysis was unreliable because regional variations and individual speech patterns made definitive identification nearly impossible. But vaccination scars were biological facts that couldn't be argued away or explained differently depending on the interrogator's skill. Either you had the marks or you didn't, and the marks told an undeniable story about where you received medical treatment and when. German medical reports from the period included direct observations that revealed both the method's effectiveness and its psychological impact. Dr. Brenner wrote in a February 1945 report that the vaccination protocol had reduced interrogation time by an average of 62% because women without proper marks usually confessed their resistance activities rather than undergo prolonged questioning when they knew their physical evidence had already betrayed them. Hauptmann Fest noted in his interrogation summaries that the inspection created a unique form of pressure because prisoners couldn't maintain hope that better lies or stronger willpower would eventually convince their captors. The truth was literally written on their skin in patterns they couldn't change or hide. The full scale of implementation became clear only after the war when Allied intelligence compiled reports from liberated prisoners. Over 1,500 women had undergone the vaccination inspection protocol at some point during their captivity between December 1944 and May 1945. The practice had become standard operating procedure across the entire Western Front detention system, implemented with German efficiency and consistency that made variation between facilities minimal. The vaccination inspection protocol ended abruptly on May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally to Allied forces and the detention camps opened their gates to release thousands of prisoners who had survived the war. And the practice that had determined life or death for over 1,500 women simply stopped existing overnight as military necessity evaporated, and German officers either fled or waited nervously for war crimes investigations that would determine their own fates. But the implications of what had happened in those cold examination rooms continued to echo through military medicine and prisoner identification systems for decades afterward, shaping policies and procedures in ways that the desperate German commanders of 1944 never imagined or intended. Post-war analysis conducted by Allied medical intelligence teams revealed facts that made even hardened military officers uncomfortable. But the vaccination inspection method had proven 89% accurate in distinguishing legitimate military personnel from civilian resistance fighters, a success rate that was disturbingly high by any intelligence standard. The 9% error rate included both false positives, where resistance fighters somehow had military-style vaccination patterns, and false negatives, where legitimate Allied personnel lacked proper marks due to medical exemptions or administrative failures. The 2% remaining cases involved ambiguous situations that never reached definitive conclusions, even after extensive investigation. From a purely technical perspective divorced from moral considerations, the German protocol had worked exactly as Dr. Brenner designed it to work. The human cost of that effectiveness was another matter entirely. Captain Sarah Mitchell survived the war and returned to the United States in June 1945 aboard a transport ship crowded with soldiers and nurses eager to leave Europe behind forever. She received a Bronze Star for her service during the Battle of the Bulge and was promoted to major within a year of her return. Her military career continued for another 22 years, and she eventually became chief of nursing at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, where she served from 1965 until her retirement in 1967. She rarely spoke publicly about her experience as a German prisoner and almost never mentioned the vaccination inspections that had determined her fate on that frozen December morning. When journalists or historians asked about her time in Stalag 9B, she would offer brief factual statements and then redirect conversation to other topics. But colleagues who worked closely with her noticed that she devoted enormous energy to establishing comprehensive medical documentation standards for all military personnel under her supervision. Mitchell's work at Walter Reed resulted in new policies that required detailed vaccination records with photographic documentation, serial numbers tracked through central databases, and biometric verification systems that made it nearly impossible for anyone to claim military medical status without ironclad proof. The policies she championed went far beyond what military regulations required at the time, and some administrators questioned whether such extensive documentation was necessary in peacetime. Mitchell never explained her reasoning in official memos, but the connection was obvious to anyone who knew her history. She was ensuring that no future conflict would force military personnel to prove their identities through invasive physical examinations conducted by enemy captors. The marks would still matter, but they would be documented, verified, and protected by layers of bureaucratic record-keeping that would make the German inspection protocol obsolete. The practice that began as an enemy interrogation technique transformed gradually into standard protective procedure across NATO military medical systems. By 1960, every member of the United States Armed Forces received a medical identification card containing photographs of their vaccination sites, along with precise measurements, dates of administration, batch numbers of vaccines used, and the signature of the administering medical officer. British, Canadian, and French military services adopted similar systems with minor variations. The documentation served multiple purposes, including tracking vaccine efficacy, preventing disease outbreaks, and identifying personnel in cases of amnesia or severe injury. But the underlying principle remained identical to what Dr. Brenner had recognized in December 1944. Vaccination marks provided biological evidence that couldn't be easily forged or denied, and proper documentation of those marks created an identification system more reliable than paper documents alone. The broader lesson embedded in this history spoke to how crisis forces innovation in directions that peacetime planning never anticipates. The German officers who developed the vaccination inspection protocol weren't conducting groundbreaking medical research or inventing new technologies. They were simply applying existing knowledge about vaccination procedures in a novel way under intense pressure to solve an immediate operational problem. Their solution worked precisely because it exploited an unintended consequence of Allied military medical policy. American and British commanders had required vaccinations to protect troops from disease, never imagining that those same vaccination scars would later become evidence used against captured personnel. The effectiveness emerged from connecting two separate systems that were never designed to interact. Modern military personnel carry identification that would seem almost absurdly comprehensive to soldiers from earlier eras. Biometric databases store fingerprints, iris scans, DNA profiles, dental records, and yes, detailed documentation of vaccination history, complete with photographs and measurements that would satisfy even the most demanding German inspector from 1944. The technology has advanced enormously, but the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Military organizations need ways to verify identity that survive the chaos of combat, the confusion of mass casualties, and the complications of capture by enemy forces. The marks we bear on our bodies, whether natural or medically induced, provide that verification when all other evidence fails or disappears. As we face contemporary questions about biometric identification, medical privacy, and the verification of protected status in conflict zones, the story of the vaccination inspections reminds us that these debates are not new. The tension between security needs and personal dignity has existed as long as humans have fought wars and taken prisoners. Every generation believes it faces unique challenges, but the underlying dilemmas repeat with different technologies and slightly modified circumstances. In 1944, the question was whether examining vaccination scars violated prisoner dignity. In 2025, we debate whether requiring biometric scans at borders violates human rights. The specific details change, but the fundamental conflict between verification and privacy remains constant. The women who stood under harsh lights in freezing examination rooms during that winter of 1944 would probably be surprised to learn that their ordeal influenced military medical policy for the next 80 years. They weren't thinking about future implications when German medical officers measured their vaccination scars. They were thinking about survival, about seeing their families again, about enduring one more day of captivity. But their experience taught military planners lessons that couldn't be ignored. The marks on our bodies tell stories we don't choose and can't erase. In desperate times, those stories become evidence that determines our fate. The challenge for any society that claims to value human dignity is ensuring that biological facts are used to protect people rather than endanger them, to verify identity rather than strip away privacy, to save lives rather than justify executions. The scars remain neutral, neither good nor evil. How we use the information they provide reveals who we are and what we value. When crisis forces impossible choices,